Arrest her now. The words cracked across the busy Charlotte sidewalk like a starter pistol, turning heads in every direction. Shoppers stopped mid-step. A man carrying 2 paper coffee cups froze beside a parking meter. Even the traffic rolling past on East Trade Street seemed to slow as dozens of eyes locked onto the scene unfolding outside a flower stand. Margaret Sinclair stood near the curb in an immaculate cream-colored coat, one arm extended as she pointed directly at Angela Brooks. Her expression carried the certainty of someone accustomed to being believed the moment she spoke. "That woman threatened me," Margaret said loudly. "She needs to be arrested." Within seconds, Officer Daniel Cooper stepped forward from his patrol vehicle. The afternoon sun reflected off his badge as he approached. He glanced briefly at Margaret, then at Angela. The difference in how long he looked at each woman was almost impossible to notice, yet it changed everything. Angela Brooks stood perfectly still. At 35 years old, she had spent most of her life helping people others overlooked. Her dark green jacket showed signs of wear. A canvas tote bag hung from her shoulder. Inside were folders from the Youth Outreach Center where she worked and a half-finished birthday card one of the children had insisted she take home. None of that mattered now. To the growing crowd, she was simply the woman being accused. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me," Officer Cooper said. Angela blinked slowly. Around her, phones were already rising into the air. Tiny black screens reflected sunlight as strangers prepared to record whatever happened next. "Officer," Angela replied calmly, "you don't know what really happened." Cooper's jaw tightened. "You can explain that later." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Some people exchanged knowing looks. Others whispered theories they had invented only seconds earlier. Human beings loved stories, especially when they believed they already knew the ending. Margaret folded her arms. The corner of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. She looked less frightened than victorious. Angela noticed it immediately. Across the street, a city bus hissed to a stop. A gust of warm spring air carried the scent of food trucks and fresh flowers through the intersection. Somewhere nearby, a street musician continued playing a slow melody on a saxophone, completely unaware that a woman's reputation was being decided a few yards away. "Please check the security cameras," Angela said. Her voice remained steady. "There are cameras on the flower stand. Cameras above the pharmacy. They'll show everything." Officer Cooper glanced toward the storefronts but never turned his head fully. His attention returned to Margaret. Then back to Angela. The decision had already been made. "Ma'am, put your hands behind your back." A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone gasped softly. Someone else whispered, "I knew it." Angela felt every eye on her. The weight of those stares pressed harder than the late afternoon heat. Yet she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked past the officer toward a frightened little boy standing beside the flower stand. He couldn't have been older than 10. Tears glistened in his eyes. He looked as though he wanted to say something but was too afraid to speak. Angela's heart sank. That expression told her more than any security camera ever could. The truth was standing right there on the sidewalk. Nobody was listening. As Officer Cooper guided her toward the patrol car, Angela took one last look at the crowd surrounding them. Some appeared curious. Some appeared satisfied. Most appeared certain. None of them understood that within the next few hours, a single phone call would unravel everything they thought they had witnessed. The ride to the precinct lasted less than 15 minutes, but for Angela Brooks it felt much longer. The city moved beyond the window in fragments of reflected sunlight, storefront signs, and pedestrians hurrying through their afternoon routines. None of them knew her story. None of them knew that every Tuesday and Thursday she stayed late at the Youth Outreach Center because some children needed a safe place to finish homework before going home. None of them knew she kept extra snacks in her desk drawer for kids who quietly admitted they had skipped lunch. To the People who had watched from the sidewalk, she had become a single moment frozen in time. The patrol vehicle turned into the station parking lot. Angela sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching clouds gather beyond the skyline. Gray edges stretched across the blue sky, promising rain before sunset. Officer Cooper remained silent during the drive. He seemed convinced that silence was professionalism. Angela had met enough people in authority to recognize the difference between confidence and certainty. One was earned. The other was dangerous. Inside the station, fluorescent lights cast a pale glow across polished floors. Phones rang in distant offices. Keyboards clicked. Conversations drifted through partially open doors. It was an ordinary afternoon for everyone except her. A desk sergeant took down information while Angela waited in a chair near the booking area. She answered every question calmly. Name. Address. Occupation. When she said she worked as a community outreach coordinator for children and families, the sergeant briefly glanced up from his screen before continuing to type. The moment passed quickly. Facts rarely carried the same weight as first impressions. Across town, the youth center's front doors were beginning to close for the evening. A dozen children had expected Angela to be there. One little girl named Lily would probably ask why Miss Brooks had not shown up to help finish her science project. Another boy, Marcus, would check the hallway every few minutes because he always liked being the first to tell Angela about his basketball practice. Thinking about them hurt more than sitting inside the station. They depended on her consistency. She hated breaking promises. Meanwhile, Margaret Sinclair sat comfortably inside a luxury SUV heading toward her downtown office. Her reflection drifted across the tinted glass as buildings passed outside. She appeared relaxed now, almost relieved. The driver asked whether she wanted to stop for coffee. Margaret smiled and said yes. The crisis, as far as she was concerned, had been resolved. Back at the station, Angela noticed movement through a nearby window. Rain had begun to fall. Tiny droplets slid down the glass in winding paths. For a moment she closed her eyes and remembered the frightened boy standing beside the flower stand. His face refused to leave her mind. Something about his expression had felt heavier than fear. It looked like disappointment. The disappointment of someone who had hoped an adult would do the right thing. Angela opened her eyes as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Somewhere beyond the station walls, the truth still existed exactly as it had happened. Cameras had recorded it. Witnesses had seen it. And one frightened child knew every detail. The only question was whether anyone would care enough to listen before it was too late. Officer Daniel Cooper sat at his desk reviewing reports while rain tapped steadily against the station windows. The sound blended with ringing phones and distant conversations, creating the familiar rhythm of another ordinary shift. Yet something about the woman sitting quietly down the hall continued to linger in the back of his mind. Most people placed in her position reacted differently. They argued. They complained. They demanded immediate answers. Angela Brooks had done none of those things. She had asked for security footage. Then she had waited. Across the city, Margaret Sinclair stepped into the top floor offices of Sinclair Urban Development. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Charlotte skyline, now blurred by sheets of rain. Employees greeted her as she passed. Some smiled nervously. Others immediately returned to their work. Margaret carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent years being the most important person in every room she entered. Her company controlled luxury properties across North Carolina. Her name opened doors. Her opinions shaped decisions. And because she had lived inside that reality for so long, she rarely questioned whether she might be wrong. Inside a corner office lined with framed awards and architectural renderings, Margaret set her purse on a polished walnut desk. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. The screen displayed a familiar name. Ethan Sinclair. Her son. Margaret answered with a smile. Hello, sweetheart. On the other end. Silence lingered for several seconds. Mother, Ethan finally said. His voice sounded unusually serious. Where are you? Margaret frowned. At the office. Why? Another pause followed. Ethan rarely paused. As a corporate attorney in Atlanta, he had built a career on precision and confidence. Hearing hesitation in his voice felt strange. I need to ask you about something that happened downtown today, he said. Margaret glanced toward the rain-covered windows. It was nothing important. A misunderstanding. A misunderstanding involving a woman near a flower stand? Ethan asked. The smile disappeared from Margaret's face. Who told you that? Someone sent me a video. Margaret slowly lowered herself into her chair. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty brushed against her confidence. Meanwhile, at the station, Angela remained seated near the booking area. The fluorescent lights reflected softly against the polished floor. A vending machine hummed nearby. She checked the clock on the wall. Nearly 2 hours had passed. The youth center would be closed by now. The children would have gone home. She hoped someone had remembered to give Marcus the permission slip she promised to sign. Small details occupied her thoughts because dwelling on anything else felt exhausting. Then a young officer walked through the hallway carrying a cardboard tray of coffees. He slowed as he passed Angela. Recognition flickered across his face. Wait, he said quietly. You are Angela Brooks? Angela looked up. Yes. The officer blinked. My little sister goes to the center where you work. Angela offered a faint smile. What is her name? Jasmine. The young officer's expression softened immediately. You helped her after our father passed away. Neither spoke for a moment. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside, something else had begun to shift. For the first time since arriving at the station, someone was no longer seeing a suspect. They were seeing the person behind the accusation. The young officer shifted the cardboard tray of coffee cups from one hand to the other, still looking at Angela with quiet disbelief. Jasmine talks about you all the time, he said. She says you never let anyone sit alone during after-school programs. Angela smiled faintly. Your sister is a remarkable kid. Before he could answer, a voice called his name from across the room. He nodded politely and continued down the hallway, but not before glancing back once more. That single interaction lasted less than a minute, yet it left an impression that spread farther than either of them realized. Officer Cooper had watched the exchange from his desk. He noticed the respect in the younger officer's face. He noticed something else too. Nobody looked relieved after identifying a dangerous person. Yet that young officer had looked relieved. As if seeing Angela there made no sense at all. Across town, Ethan Sinclair sat in his Atlanta office staring at a paused video on his computer screen. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the 32nd floor. The footage was grainy, captured by a bystander standing near the flower stand. He replayed it again. And then again. Every time he watched, the same detail stood out. Angela never appeared aggressive. Never appeared threatening. If anything, she looked concerned. Ethan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. Years of practicing law had taught him one lesson above all others. The first version of a story was rarely the complete version. His phone remained pressed against his ear. Mother, he said carefully, what happened before that video started? Silence answered him. Long enough to make his concern grow. Mother? Margaret stood beside her office window overlooking the rain-soaked city below. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. That woman interfered, she finally replied. She made a scene. Ethan frowned. Interfered with what? Another pause. This one longer. There was a child selling flowers. Ethan's expression hardened. And? Margaret exhaled slowly. I told him he could not stand in front of my building. And Angela Brooks stepped in? Margaret did not answer directly. She did not need to. Meanwhile, several miles away, the flower stand remained closed beneath the rain. Water dripped steadily from the striped canopy. Nearby security cameras continued, recording everything around them, storing each second without judgment, without assumptions, without prejudice. Facts waited patiently even when people did not. Back at the station, Officer Cooper opened the initial report and read through it again. The words felt different now. Not because they had changed, but because doubt had entered the room. Doubt moved quietly. It never arrived with sirens. It arrived with small questions. Why had Angela immediately asked for camera footage? Why had she remained calm for hours? Why did people who knew her react with surprise rather than concern? His desk phone suddenly rang. Cooper reached for it without looking at the caller identification. Officer Cooper speaking. A calm voice answered. My name is Ethan Sinclair. Cooper sat upright immediately. The name was impossible to miss. Everyone in Charlotte knew the Sinclair family. I believe, Ethan continued, that you may want to review every available camera angle before making any further decisions. Because the woman currently sitting in your station is not the person you should be worried about. The station suddenly felt smaller. Officer Cooper remained motionless with the phone pressed against his ear while rain streaked down the windows behind him. Ethan Sinclair's words lingered in the silence that followed. What exactly are you saying? Cooper finally asked. Papers rustled on the other end of the line. I am saying I reviewed footage from 3 separate sources, Ethan replied. The flower stand camera. A pharmacy security camera. And a traffic camera positioned at the intersection. They all tell the same story. Cooper glanced toward the hallway where Angela sat quietly beneath the fluorescent lights. She was reading a pamphlet someone had left on a nearby table. No frustration. No panic. Just patience. And what story is that? Cooper asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. The woman sitting in your station stepped in to protect a child who was being pressured to leave the sidewalk during heavy rain. She never threatened anyone. She never escalated anything. She was trying to help. Cooper felt his stomach tighten. Across town, Margaret Sinclair stood frozen beside her. Office window as Ethan spoke through a second call on speakerphone. Every word seemed louder than the last. Outside, lightning flashed behind distant skyscrapers. Mother, Ethan said firmly, why did you not tell me that part? Margaret crossed her arms. Because it is irrelevant. It is the entire reason the situation happened. The room fell silent. For the first time all day, Margaret had no immediate response. Back at the station, Cooper opened the incident report again. The neat lines of text suddenly looked incomplete. Missing pieces. Missing context. Missing truth. There is something else, Ethan continued. Cooper closed his eyes briefly. Somehow he knew the conversation was only getting worse. Go ahead. The child involved is the son of a maintenance worker employed at one of my mother's properties. His name is Caleb. 10 years old. Cooper listened carefully. And according to the footage, Caleb was standing alone in the rain selling flowers to help his family pay utility bills. The words landed heavily. Cooper looked toward the dark window. Rainwater flowed down the glass in silver lines. He imagined the boy standing there holding flowers while adults argued around him. Angela Brooks bought flowers from him, Ethan said. Then she gave him her umbrella. Cooper said nothing. Officer, does that sound like the person described in your report? The question hung in the air. Meanwhile, Angela sat unaware of the details unfolding around her. She simply watched raindrops race down the window. Somewhere inside the station a clock ticked steadily. Minute after minute. Truth moved slowly, but it was moving. Then another officer hurried into the room carrying a tablet. "Sir," he called. "We just received the camera footage request." Cooper looked up sharply. The younger officer set the tablet on the desk and pressed play. Grainy video filled the screen. There was Caleb. There was Margaret. And there was Angela. For several moments nobody spoke. The footage showed exactly what Ethan had described. Every second. Every angle. Every detail. When the video ended, the room remained silent except for the distant rumble of thunder. Cooper stared at the frozen image on the screen. The evidence was undeniable. The story he believed only hours earlier had completely fallen apart. And for the first time since the afternoon began, he realized the person waiting quietly down the hall had been telling the truth from the very beginning. The moment the footage stopped playing, the silence inside the station was no longer neutral. It was heavy, almost uncomfortable, as if every person in the room had to adjust their understanding of what they had seen earlier in the day. Officer Cooper slowly lowered himself into his chair, eyes still fixed on the darkened tablet screen. The image of the flower stand remained burned into his memory. Not the accusation. Not the words. But the reality that had just been proven frame by frame. Across the hallway, Angela Brooks remained seated in the same chair. She had not been told anything yet. Time moved differently for her now. Each minute stretched longer than the last, shaped by uncertainty rather than action. She noticed a slight change in the atmosphere. Footsteps were slower. Voices were lower. Doors that had been closing abruptly earlier now lingered half open. Something had shifted, though she did not yet know what. Officer Daniel Cooper stood up without speaking and walked toward the holding area. Another officer followed, holding the tablet carefully as if it now contained something more delicate than evidence. Cooper stopped at the doorway where Angela sat. For a moment, he simply observed her. There was no tension in her posture. No visible anger. Only patience, the kind that came from people who had spent years waiting for systems to do what they were supposed to do. "Angela Brooks," Cooper said quietly. She looked up. "Yes." A long pause followed. Cooper exhaled slowly. "We have reviewed the footage." Angela did not respond immediately. Her expression remained steady, but something subtle changed in her eyes. Not relief. Not surprise. Something closer to quiet understanding. "And?" she asked. Cooper hesitated. It was not often that an officer had to undo a decision so completely. "You are free to go," he said finally. The words felt heavier than expected. Angela blinked. "Once. What about the report?" Cooper shifted his weight. "It will be corrected." Another pause followed. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang and was quickly answered. Life in the station continued, but it no longer felt the same. Angela slowly stood. The chair beneath her shifted slightly against the floor. She adjusted her jacket and looked toward the hallway where she had first been brought in. For a brief moment, she seemed unsure whether to leave immediately or say something more. Cooper spoke again before she could walk away. "Miss Brooks," he said. She turned. His voice softened. "I am sorry." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of the entire afternoon. Angela studied him for a moment. There was no anger in her expression. Only tiredness. The kind that came from being misunderstood more times than one person should have to experience. "Make sure it does not happen again," she said calmly. Not a demand. Not a threat. Just a truth stated plainly. Then she walked toward the exit. As she passed through the main corridor, officers who had seen her earlier now stepped aside without hesitation. No one spoke. Not because they were ordered to remain silent, but because they understood that silence was appropriate. Outside the station doors, the rain had begun to slow. The city lights reflected softly on the wet pavement. Angela stepped out into the cool air and paused for a moment under the overhang. She looked up at the sky where the clouds were beginning to break apart. A faint line of evening light pushed through. Somewhere behind her, the station doors closed quietly. Inside, Officer Cooper remained standing in the same place, still processing what had just changed. He looked once more at the empty chair where Angela had been sitting. Then at the tablet in his hand. The truth had not arrived loudly. It had arrived through a phone call, a set of cameras, and a boy who had been brave enough to stand in the rain when no one else was paying attention. And now, finally, it had reached the place where it mattered most. Outside the station, the air had changed. The rain was still falling, but it was lighter now, turning into a soft mist that blurred the edges of the city lights. Angela Brooks stood under the concrete overhang for a moment longer, watching the world move as if nothing had happened. Cars passed slowly through puddles, headlights stretching into long reflections across the wet street. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, even after an extraordinary truth had been revealed. Behind her, the station doors opened again. Officer Daniel Cooper stepped out first, followed by a second officer holding a file that now felt significantly different from the one created hours earlier. Cooper stopped a few feet away from Angela. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of distant traffic filled the space between them. Finally, Cooper broke the silence. "The report has been updated," he said. Angela turned slightly. "Updated how?" Cooper hesitated before answering. "It reflects what the footage showed. Your actions were consistent with assisting a minor in a public space. There is no charge. No violation." Angela nodded slowly, absorbing the words without visible celebration. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement that truth had finally aligned with record. "Thank you," she said simply. Cooper looked down for a brief moment before meeting her eyes again. "I should have seen it sooner." Angela did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the street where the flower stand still sat under its striped canopy. The boy was not there now, but his presence lingered in her memory. "Sometimes," she said gently, "people only see what they expect to see." Cooper nodded. The words landed more deeply than any formal apology could. A short distance away, another vehicle pulled up. Ethan Sinclair stepped out, holding an umbrella in one hand and a folder in the other. He scanned the sidewalk until he saw Angela. His expression shifted immediately from focus to relief. "Miss Brooks," he said as he approached. Angela turned toward him. "You did not have to come all the way here," she said. Ethan shook his head. "I needed to make sure this was resolved correctly." He paused, glancing briefly at the station behind her. "And I wanted to apologize on behalf of what almost happened to you today." Angela studied him for a moment. The rain caught on the edge of his umbrella, dripping steadily onto the pavement. "You were not the one who made the decision," she said. Ethan exhaled. "No, but I am part of the system that did." A silence followed. It was not uncomfortable, but reflective. Angela adjusted the strap of her bag. "There is a child who still needs support," she said quietly. Ethan nodded immediately. "Caleb. I already arranged for a counselor through your center. He will not be alone in this anymore." That answer seemed to settle something unspoken between them. Across the street, Margaret Sinclair remained inside her vehicle, watching through the tinted glass. The confidence she had carried earlier in the day had not fully returned. Instead, she observed quietly as the consequences of her certainty unfolded in ways she had not anticipated. Inside the station, Officer Cooper stood near the entrance, watching Angela speak with Ethan. For the first time since he had worn the uniform, he understood how quickly a moment of assumption could become something far larger than itself. Not just for one person, but for everyone connected to that moment. Angela finally turned away from the station. She stepped into the light rain, no longer as a suspect, but as someone returning to the life she had been pulled from. The city around her remained unchanged, but something within the small circle of people involved had shifted permanently. As she walked down the sidewalk, the sound of the rain softened into a steady rhythm. Behind her, the station lights continued to glow, but they no longer defined her story. Ahead of her, the street opened into evening, and for the first time that day, there was nothing holding her back. The rain had nearly stopped by the time Angela Brooks reached the corner of 5th Street. The city felt different now, not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible had shifted beneath its surface. The air was cooler, cleaner, as if the weight of misunderstanding had finally lifted from the streets she walked. Behind her, the glow of the station faded into the distance. Inside that building, decisions had been corrected, reports had been rewritten, and conversations were already turning into lessons about procedure and oversight. But for Angela, none of that mattered as much as the quiet return to normal life she had long been waiting for. She adjusted her jacket and continued walking, passing storefronts that reflected her silhouette in soft, distorted light. Somewhere ahead, the youth center was still open for another hour, and she needed to check in before the evening ended. As she approached the familiar brick building, the front door swung open suddenly. A small group of children rushed out, their voices overlapping in excitement. At the front was Marcus, holding a folded piece of paper in one hand and waving it like a victory flag. "Miss Brooks," he shouted. Angela stopped immediately, a smile forming before she even understood why. Marcus ran toward her without hesitation and nearly collided into her arms. "You came back," he said quickly, as if afraid she might disappear again if he spoke too slowly. Angela knelt slightly to steady him. "Of course I came back," she said gently. "Where else would I be?" Behind Marcus, Lily appeared next, holding a notebook tightly against her chest. Her eyes were wide with relief. "We thought you were gone," she said softly. Angela shook her head. "I was never gone." The children gathered around her, forming a small circle on the sidewalk. Their energy filled the space that had felt empty only hours earlier. One of the staff members stood at the doorway, watching quietly, aware that something meaningful had returned to the building without needing explanation. Inside the center, lights glowed warmly against the early evening dark. Angela stepped in with the children following closely. The sound of laughter replaced the tension that had lingered earlier in the day. For a moment, everything felt exactly as it should have been. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daniel Cooper sat alone in the station parking lot before ending his shift. The windshield of his vehicle reflected the dim glow of streetlights. He stared at it for a long time, replaying the day in his mind. Not the accusation, but the correction. Not the mistake, but the moment it was realized. He had seen how quickly certainty could form and how slowly truth sometimes arrived. His phone vibrated on the passenger seat. A message from Internal Review confirmed that the incident report had been officially closed with updated findings. He exhaled slowly, but the feeling in his chest was not relief. It was awareness. A reminder that responsibility did not end when a case was closed. It continued long after the paperwork was filed. At Sinclair Urban Development, Margaret Sinclair remained in her office long after most employees had left. The city outside her window was now fully lit, glowing with movement and distance. Ethan's words still echoed in her mind, not as accusation, but as consequence. She had spent years believing that control ensured correctness. That certainty protected order. But today had shown her something different. Control without understanding was only assumption dressed as confidence. She looked down at her desk where her phone rested silently. No calls. No messages. Only reflection. For the first time in a long time, she did not immediately trust her own interpretation of events. She leaned back in her chair and allowed the silence to settle without interruption. Back at the youth center, Angela sat with the children as they worked on their assignments. The room was calm, filled with the quiet sound of pencils moving across paper and pages turning. Marcus occasionally looked up to make sure she was still there. Each time, she nodded reassuringly. Outside, night had fully arrived. The streetlights cast soft circles across the sidewalk, and the world beyond the building continued its rhythm without pause. Yet inside, something steady had returned. Not because everything had been perfect, but because truth had finally found its place among them. The night settled gently over the city, wrapping Charlotte in a quiet glow of streetlights and distant traffic. Inside the youth center, Angela Brooks moved between tables as the children continued their homework, their voices now soft and steady. The earlier chaos of the day felt like a memory that belonged to someone else, yet it still lived quietly in. The way people looked at her, with a little more care, a little more understanding than before. Marcus finished writing his last sentence and slid his paper forward with a proud expression. Angela leaned over and nodded. "That is better than yesterday," she said with a small smile. Marcus grinned, then hesitated before speaking. "Miss Brooks, are you going to leave again?" The question landed softly but carried more weight than it seemed. Angela paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "No," she said gently. "Not because of today." Across the room, Lily looked up from her notebook. "We saw the video on the news screen in the office," she said. "They said you were not in trouble anymore." Angela nodded slowly. "That is correct." Lily tilted her head. "So the police made a mistake?" Angela exhaled quietly, sitting down beside her. "Sometimes people make decisions before they understand the full story," she said. "What matters is whether they are willing to correct those decisions when the truth becomes clear." The children seemed to absorb that answer in their own ways, some continuing their work, others simply watching her with quiet thoughtfulness. Meanwhile, several miles away, Officer Daniel Cooper stood outside the station for the last time that night. The air had cooled significantly, and the pavement still held the memory of the earlier rain. He placed his hands on his belt and looked out toward the empty street. The events of the day replayed in fragments, not as a single moment, but as a series of small decisions that had built toward something larger than intended. He understood now that authority without patience could easily become error, and that certainty without evidence could become harm. He was not sure how long he stood there, but eventually he reached into his pocket and turned off his radio for the night. Across town, Margaret Sinclair remained in her office, but her posture had changed. The confidence that once defined her presence felt replaced by something quieter. She looked again at the reflection in the window. The city behind her glowed with life, indifferent to status or reputation. She thought of the boy at the flower stand, of Angela standing in the rain, of Ethan's voice on the phone. Each memory carried a different weight, and together they formed a realization she could no longer ignore. She reached for her phone and opened a blank message. Her fingers hesitated above the screen before she began to type, then stopped, then typed again. Finally, she set the phone down without sending anything. Some acknowledgments, she realized, required more than words. Back at the youth center, the children began gathering their belongings. Marcus handed in his completed assignment with a sense of pride. Lily carefully stacked her notebooks and zipped her bag. Angela watched them quietly, ensuring each child was ready to leave safely. One by one, they said goodbye. The room gradually grew still, filled only with the hum of lights and the distant sound of the city outside. When the last child left, Angela remained seated for a moment longer. She looked around the room, taking in the space that had held so many small moments of trust and learning. The events of the day had not changed who she was, but they had revealed something about the world she moved through. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees lining the street. The sky above Charlotte was clear now, the storm fully past. Angela stood, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind her. As she stepped into the night, The city stretched out before her, steady and unchanged, yet carrying within it the quiet reminder that truth, once revealed, does not simply correct a moment. It reshapes everything that follows.